Hello, everyone. I'm David Constant, and welcome to the second day of Before Emotion, Further Conversations on Affectivity in Pre-Modern Cultures, the follow-up colloquium to last year's program. Once again, let me thank Sal Ranieri for his generous support of the Ranieri Colloquia and this event in particular, along with many other activities of NYU's Center for Ancient Studies. We are all grateful to him for making these events possible. Today, we will hear about how emotion and emotions were conceived in ancient Sumerian and Akkadian and classical Japanese. Like yesterday's session, after each speaker, there will be 15 minutes for questions and discussion. Those who are participating in webinar mode may pose their questions via the Q&A function. And now, let me introduce the co-organizer of this colloquium and the host for today's session, Curie Virág. Curie is a specialist in the philosophy and intellectual history of early and middle period China. She works on ethics, epistemology, and moral psychology, especially in relation to the emotions. She's the author of The Emotions in Early Chinese Philosophy and is at work on a second monograph tentatively entitled Emotional Worlds, Self, Community, and Cosmos in Medieval China. She's currently based at the University of Edinburgh, where she is senior researcher and co-project director of something that may be pronounced like Paixue, P-A-I-X-U-E. It's a cross-cultural and cross-disciplinary research project funded by the European Research Council and dedicated to classicizing learning in medieval Chinese and Byzantine thought. Her co-edited volume with Douglas Cairns, In the Mind, in the Body, and in the World, Emotions in Early China and Ancient Greece, will appear in January, published by Oxford University Press. Curie, take it away.
Thank you so much, David. It's an honor to be part of this project and to be moderating today's session. I'd just like to say that David was very much the mastermind behind this whole project. So I was thrilled to be invited to co-organize. So it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Professor John Wallace, who is a specialist in classical Japanese literature, especially in the Heian period. He has recently retired from the Department of East Asian Languages and Civil Cultures at the University of California, Berkeley, which is my alma mater. His research interests include the status of self and identity, the mental processes of interpretation and East Asian ethical frameworks, aesthetics, and tea culture. His publications include 2 monographs, Objects of Discourse, Memoirs by Women of Heian Japan, and Interpreting Love Narratives in East Asian Literature and Film. He has also authored numerous articles on pre-modern Japanese literature and is currently working on a multi-volume project of poetry criticism and interpretive theory with the working title Gathering Plum Blossoms, a journal through Japanese poems. Professor Wallace will be speaking about emotions in the classical Japanese tradition. Professor Wallace, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction, Curie. Good afternoon to all of the participants. And let me just start by thanking David and Curie for inviting me to be part of this very interesting project, and to Anna for the absolutely necessary behind-the-scenes support and getting all of us organized. And of course, to NYU for making this event possible. Let me share my PowerPoint with you. So I had started on this project by thinking that since my expertise is in pre-modern Japanese literature, I would identify and share early Japanese views of emotions. I hoped others might find something new or useful among my descriptions. But I found that the meta levels of this project are exceptionally challenging. In particular, I have been struggling with how to understand the relationship of culture and emotions. In order to describe pre-modern Japanese emotions, I expected I would also need to explain relevant aspects of early Japanese culture. But I soon realized that to determine what cultural information is relevant requires understanding how culture relates to emotions. That in itself is an enormous question. But in addition, I found myself concluding that not only did culture shape emotions, but emotions shape culture. And in this way of thinking, the texts we look to for information of what pre-modern emotions might be are themselves cultural shapers of emotions. Text embedded in culture, emotions driving cultural change, culture having a hand in emotional experience. All of these seem to be interesting, challenging, moving targets. It is difficult even to define any of the key moving parts of this challenge. And making some progress on the question of what are emotions seems to be both the goal and the start point of our Before Emotion project. And what is culture? That's also under debate. What is the relationship between the two? How do they shape one another, if they do, as I think they do? Obviously, defining the terms emotion or culture and suggesting theories about how they are related are opportunities for extended debate. But I do have working definitions for today's talk. These definitions obviously arise from my own personal history of research on the one hand, and on the other, the cultures that make me who I am, willingly or not, and on the other hand, the destination of where the ideas will be shared, which in this case is here today with you. To repeat, these are no more than working definitions that were useful to me. I've not tested them in other analytic contexts, but I think sharing the definitions might help listeners frame my observations. So emotions, I will define, are subjective experiences that arise as epiphenomena from the complex, ever-persistent presence of body, constructed identity, situations real or imagined, and culture. This way of defining emotion allows me to reach beyond the primary emotions to include mood, tone, attitude, and such. These are mental states that are partly affective, and partly cognitive. I want to include these because I'm thinking that it is in these non-primal emotions that arise together with thoughts where culture is most active. If that is true, then research and analysis, including these areas, might be particularly useful towards identifying differences and similarities between pre-modern and modern emotions. It also happens to be useful for thinking about how language participates in the expression of emotions and the subjective experience of them. And to link up with a comment Professor Carter made when discussing Mayan language, I would like to think of language broadly, as he did, to include visual clues, body language, facial expression, and so on. Culture, the way I see it, is the many networks of significances known to an individual that affects how the individual interprets things, attributes meaning and significance, and flowing from that makes decision. The question of how emotions and culture interact is more complicated. To think of emotion-culture dyads as having back and forth influences seems oversimple. The relationship seems to me now closer to an entanglement in the quantum physics sense, where particle A cannot be described without including the state of particle B, even when they are separated by enormous differences, and the effect one has on the other is unpredictable. We, acting consciously or not as members of a culture, decide to associate, or have been signaled by culture to associate, certain emotions with certain objects, thoughts, and situations, past, present, and future. But in acting thus, we have been, are, and will be an unpredictable influence on a culture that has been, is, and will influence us. To oversimplify some, while a culture might nudge us to feel a certain way, say, for example, consider that wearing shoes in the house is something to feel uncomfortable about, how this will shape culture is unpredictable. In the case of Japan, it had considerable influence on architectural design. and that design then placed its own influences upon culture. For example, how to greet visitors, and that engenders other emotions not obviously related to the initial concern of unwelcome dirt. So those are some of my general thoughts about the topic. Let's move on to pre-modern Japan. My comments today are based on literary prose texts written by women for women in and around the 11th century. By this time, Japan had been receiving Chinese culture directly from China and via Korea for hundreds of years. Continental influence at all levels was enormous: law, medicine, the arts, government, religion, as Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism. Just about everything, but not everything. I selected this particular moment in history because it is something of an inflection point for the Japanese. They have broken off official relations with the continent. They have developed an indigenous script so that Chinese characters were no longer necessary for writing the Japanese language onto paper. And they had turned intensely inward to develop and laud things Japanese. Even so, and even though I will not be doing so today, a full accounting of pre-modern Japanese emotions needs to energetically embrace the roles of Chinese and Korean cultures. Today, though, for the purposes of uncomplicating things, I selected texts and topics that focus on Japanese native beliefs and practices. There are no systematic studies in Japan of emotion or Japanese emotion until the 18th century. Therefore, if we want to explore and explain pre-modern Japanese emotions, we cannot avoid including the fraught work of interpreting primary texts. And as Professor Beckman said yesterday in honest answer to a question, we cannot really know the pre-modern mind. But if we lower our expectations to what we can agree is plausible and never suggest our answers are final, we can make some reasonable estimates. And maybe that's good enough. And at least, unlike all of yesterday's examples, even when limiting our time window to around the 11th century, I have dozens of lengthy texts to help with interpretation and speculation. And by the way, in response to a point raised yesterday, in the case of pre-modern Japanese, yes, there are words for the category of human experience we would call emotion. The text that provided all the start points for my analysis is The Tale of Genji. Its author is Murasaki Shikibu. She was born in the 10th century, died in the 11th century. She was a diarist, a poet, and a writer of fictional narrative. The Tale of Genji is her masterpiece. It's big. It's about 750,000 words long. In this story, Genji is an impossibly handsome man. He is meant to attract our sympathy because he was removed from royalty by his father, who feared the rivalrous anger of one of his empresses. But although drop-dead handsome, incredibly rich, his mansion is about the size of 4 football fields, and more talented than anyone in terms of the arts, he is essentially a skirt chaser. Murasaki uses the amorous situations created by him and other men to show how the social fates of women were blown about by the capricious movements of male desire. Some of her women are able to navigate and survive such storms. Others die. None are happy. In her tale, the men are mostly dolts. Murasaki's expansive and sublime vision of human emotion lies in the nuanced calculations, conclusions, and feelings of the women. So, what I would like to do is introduce 3 approaches to finding emotions in this massive text. I use the word finding in the title ambiguously as both finding something that is there and setting out to find something, anything, even if the discovery is really only an invention of the method. I think this sort of self-awareness is particularly healthy for our challenging topic. What you're seeing is a summary slide of the 3 approaches. It will reappear now and then. You can see that I'm reporting on one person's analysis of emotions in Genji, then speculating what a different scholar would say if he had undertaken an analysis of Genji, and then finally, an approach that is strictly my own. The first finding is by Motoori Nobunaga. He was a towering intellectual of the 19th century. He claims that a single theme dominates Genji's 1,000 pages, namely mono no aware. Often this is translated as pathos, but that erases some of its qualities. Aware originally was an exclamation that simply meant, ah. It was an utterance when encountering something surprising or impressive or moving. Mono etymologically means spirit. Here it grammatically means somehow. So in a less interpretive translation of mono no aware, we might think of it as the feeling when someone somehow, when the feeling when somehow something makes me want to exclaim, ah. Motoori argues convincingly that in the tale of Genji, mono no aware has a more specific meaning. Namely, when we observe something small in an expansive context, thinking of its fate, which is likely not to be a good one, when, in other words, we think in terms of expansive time and place something that attracts our sympathy into the middle of that big time. When this combination arises in our mind, we understand the human condition and we sigh. In his explanation, the many stories of women and what happens to them are told within the enveloping theme of the heaviness of fate, framed in a Buddhist view of impermanence. Perhaps the emotion could be described as a movement of sympathy towards others that pairs with a personal oppression felt from being reminded of our fragility. The second finding comes from borrowing the ideas of the 20th century Freudian psychiatrist Doi Takeo. Doi did not publish a systematic critique of the tale of Genji, but because of the universality of his claims, it is possible to bring his theory to it. He argues that the key emotion of a relationship, specifically a Japanese relationship, is an emotion called amai. The word derives from the idea of sweetness, but as Doi explains, in a relationship, sweetness means when person A consciously behaves in ways that evoke the desire in person B to take care of person A. Amai is sometimes translated as indulgence, but this, I feel, is simply imposing a Western judgment on the nature of the relationship. Love in this formula is, please console me, not what can I do to support you? And it is welcome within the relationship. It is a space of vulnerability where revealing one's vulnerability is a deep expression of trust. It is generally seen as charming. That is still true today. As a modern Japanese poet expresses it, I want to eat, but I also want to lose weight, says the commercial. I want to be loved, but I also don't want to give love. It works well to take Doi's idea of amai to the tale of Genji. It is clear across all the characters of the story, male and female, without exception, that amai is the way love is felt and expressed. And oh, by the way, this is again from yesterday, both men and women do cry profusely in pre-modern Japanese literature. It's one of the things that irritated my students the most. Anyway, okay, the primary verbs in the literature of this time that are used for being in love or to act lovingly are to think and to console. The verb to love exists, but it is rarely used and never used between lovers. To think means mostly spending long hours of yearning or wondering if the lover is reliable. To console means something along the lines of to erase loneliness. It also means indirectly to make love, as does the verb to see. I would suggest that mono no aware, whether identified by Motoori or invented by him, is a learned emotion that not everyone can subjectively experience. To be experienced, it needs a Buddhist framework and a certain sensibility, but it is transcultural in the sense that one need not be Japanese to experience it, or something close enough that the differences aren't substantive. Amai, on the other hand, at least Doi would say, has deep psychological preconscious origins common to us all. It is just that Japanese culture, for whatever reason, not only makes room for this part of childhood to be carried forward, it sees it as essential to the experience of bonding. And it would not be difficult to argue for how powerfully Amai has shaped Japanese culture. The third finding is my speculation looking at the tale of Genji by bringing two things to bear: Julia Kristeva's idea of the abject and Shinto religion's concern about defilement. I'm not challenging either Motoori or Doi. I agree with both of them. I just want to add a third line of thinking. For me, one of the most consistently noticeable emotional states in the tale of Genji is anxiety. But together with this, just as noticeable is the text's elegance, even when raw emotions are on the narrative stage. So I have in mind both a persistence of anxiety, where characters spend long hours worrying, sometimes to the point of death. But like a blanket over this in any strong emotion, any strong expressions of emotion, is what we now call today the quote unquote rule of courtliness. This rule governed word and demeanor, but not necessarily action. The tale of Genji has no sharp corners, even though there are many deaths, murderous jealousy, suicide, and child kidnapping. There are good reasons that anxiety is a driving element of the 11th century text written by this social group of women for women of the same social circle. Their situations entirely depended on the men of their lives, the fathers, sons, husbands, and lovers. They had no legal protection. They were expected to serve in various capacities. They could not even lock their doors. We don't need to ask why they are anxious, but we can ask how these authors expressed anxiety, or what was the thought content, the cognitive part of the subjective experience. The general answer is, not unexpectedly, that they are constantly measuring events with trepidation, expressing distrust and disappointment with regard to their men, and seem lost in endless hours of uncertainty about their social status. That is, how they think others think what their status is. As Sartre phrased it, hell is others. Jean-Paul Sartre. Fear of loss of status, or actual loss of status, is found in all the memoirs too. For example, in one, a woman's husband moves on to another woman, withdrawing his support. Actually moves on to many other women, withdrawing his support. 13 to be exact. She relocates to the outskirts of the city, now an outsider to her hometown. The memoirs are full of dangerous gossip, collective bullying, and exile. And actually here I had quite a few examples, but to stay within the 30 minutes, I dropped them out. But it's true for all of the memoirs without exception. In the tale of Genji, the entire final third of the book moves the scene to outside the capital. Life there, farther from the imperial center of power, is wholesale loneliness. The feel of the text is darker and uglier. Men are pettier. Everyone is more narrowly self-serving. The changes are so all-encompassing that some think this part of the text was written by a different person. Worries over group membership in a society that turns on group membership is enough emotional energy to explain the persistent anxiety in Murasaki's text. But the first analytic path I tried for this talk, in that one, I had posited fear of the abject as a key force. This was because I was speculating that the rule of courtliness was not just performative to prove and maintain membership in the elite, but was also a way of avoiding things uncomfortable. It just seems strange that narrated murder is so muted that it's hard to even know that someone has died. I already knew that the primary poem collection of that time, the Kokinshu, avoided any words that might be considered abject or polluting. This was because it was imperially commanded, so operates in a sacred space that cannot be defiled because the emperor is divine. Here's an example of a lament where surely the topic is an intense emotion because the poet has just lost his mother. How they resemble the sleeves of someone who mourns, those red autumn leaves, wet through the year-end showers, falling in the godless month. And actually, it is the godless month, but translating into English makes it seem like the word is important, but it's not really important. It's just the normal name for the month. Not only is the pain of loss softly spoken, even the idiom of the day that expresses intense emotions, tears of blood, is only indirectly evoked. The tears of blood that have fallen on the poet's robes are said to be red autumn leaves. In the tale of Genji, when the main character dies, her corpse is left in state for a few days, as was the practice, because pre-modern Japanese were unsure of how to determine when someone dies. Until decomposition begins, they would not confirm the death of an aristocrat. Her body is laid in a room away from the imperial grounds, ritually separated from its surroundings by purifying white sheets. When her husband and her son visit her, they indirectly note the decomposition with the phrase, "As you can see, she is clearly dead," but go on to say that she is more beautiful in death than even in life. The object has been covered over with the beautiful. So knowing that I would never find raw expression in the text used as the basis for today, one uses the verb to kill once and only once, and this is considered a major faux pas. I looked for the abject in text that came before the rule of courtliness. The Kojiki is a text almost 300 years before Genji. It is half myth and half history about the origins of Japan, its people, and the divinity of the imperial line. In one famous passage, a god lowers into the chambers of his sister, also a god, a horse that has been skinned backwards. This is so shocking to the weaving servants of the goddess that they stab themselves in their vaginas with their weaving tools and die. The reaction, both the mass suicide and the way it was accomplished, seems extreme to me, which suggests that I wasn't understanding something. The Kojiki is grounded in Shinto religious principles. Basically, wrong behavior and untoward events are two of the main causes for defilement. Flaying a horse in the opposite direction of the correct method was both an act of black magic and a bloody affair. Each of these is a major pollutant. Bringing these pollutants into the sacred space of the goddess is, in the world of the Kojiki, a truly horrifying act. While revisiting Shinto principles, I came across a principle I had not fully appreciated before, namely that if a member of a group becomes polluted, the entire group is polluted. That is why, for example, after a memorial service for my father-in-law in Japan, my brother-in-law scattered salt on me. It is a ritual purification, not for my benefit, but so as that I do not carry the pollution of death out into open society. By the way, in the time period we're considering, women were expected to leave imperial grounds during menstruation and for childbirth because of the bodily fluids involved and the possibility of death in the case of childbirth. Sick people, if visited at all, would be visited standing up with the belief that somehow that prevented pollution from the illness. And servants, when dressing noble people, hung small towelettes in front of their mouths since their breath was considered defiling. I was already of the opinion that unpleasant associations with defilement had, at their root, the revulsion that arises when encountering representatives of the abject. This view had come to me years ago through the contemporary psychoanalyst and cultural critic, Julia Kristeva. She views the abject as a breakdown of integrity of the self. Our reaction, or vomit, to a threatened breakdown in meaning caused by the loss of the distinction between subject and object, or between self and other. The primary example for what causes such a reaction is the corpse, which traumatically reminds us of our own materiality. However, other items can elicit the same reaction: the open wound, shit, sewage, even the skin that forms on the surface of warm milk. Our corporal integrity is necessary for life, as is our psychic integrity. The presence of the abject, which threatens to break up that integrity, is then, in this view, an existential challenge, a messenger of death. The only missing link needed to connect Kristeva's view of the abject with the anxiety I was seeing in the tale of Genji, as well as helping understand the full functioning of the rule of courtliness, was simply to shift the concept of worry over the integrity of one's personal identity from the individual to the group level. If identity in pre-modern Japan is a function of group association, as I think it most certainly is, then anything challenging that group integrity is a very serious affair. And according to Shinto beliefs, if one is defiled, one is doing exactly that. So in the end, the fear about a woman's social status may well be determined primarily via her status with men and spoken of in those terms. But behind this, the leverage, the mechanism for group action for exile may well be to mark that woman as defiled, whether true or not. In light of this danger, all types of behavior will be taken to avoid such a group conclusion. To illustrate how I see this mechanism working in the unspoken background of the text from this time, here's a passage from one of the memoirs. In the thousands of pages written by women of that day, rarely is there overt criticism of others, and rarely is it stated as obviously as this. While our marriage had come to that, at the residence that had so attracted his affections, it seems, his fascination had run cold since the birth of the baby the previous year. I had harbored such hatred for the woman, praying that she would live long and suffer just as I had. And can you believe it? In the end, it turned out to be exactly so, with even that baby who had been so enraptured my husband meeting his end. The woman was of royal blood, the out-of-wedlock child of a misguided prince. About her, there is no end to the bad things which would be pointless to recount. There were those who did not know her background and had gotten all excited, but the situation had changed suddenly, and what were her feelings now? When I imagined that her suffering must now exceed by a measure my own, my breast broke free of its burden. We might interpret the intensity of this paragraph as proof of how much the memoirs loved her husband, or at minimum, her marriage. If we knew more about pre-modern Japanese culture, we would see how the failure to enhance the political power of the man by gifting him a child would be a huge relief for the narrator. But what I would like to point to is something different. The early death of the child suggests that there is something wrong, something defiled about the mother. And the narrator knows that not only now will her husband entirely avoid the woman who had threatened to outcompete her in terms of childbearing, all of society will as well. Her act of writing without restraint is an act of casting this woman from her social group, knowing that she will be widely supported in this act, since the woman is now thought of as polluting their social circle. So for me, as you can see, trying to understand emotions is trying to understand pre-modern culture and the other way around. Shinto is interested in purity and taps into a revulsion for the abject to energize the need to avoid defilement. But this has the unexpected event of empowering groups to eject members and members to behave in ways so as not to be ejected. Culture teaches the importance of purity, but this need for purity is shaping the culture that did the teaching. It seems to me that it is from culture that we get our cues as to what emotions to attach to what objects or situations. For Murasaki's social group, I would suggest that there has been an association made between the powerful revulsion towards polluted objects and the powerful threat of removal from one's social group. Unpleasant or unwelcome individuals somehow are suddenly seen to be polluting, threatening the integrity of the group. The fear behind the anxiety isn't just over the instability of relationship, but also becoming polluted in the eyes of others for whatever reason. Demeanor and discursive style is carefully controlled because once this connection is made, it is nearly impossible to fight back. As Murasaki said in her own diary, paraphrasing now, if you are careful with your relationships, you can get away with anything. But if you do not, any little error can sink you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John, for a fascinating talk. I'm sure there are lots of questions while they're getting formulated. I was, if I could ask something, kind of general question about how you set up your paper. So you have sort of the three findings of emotions, and I was trying to figure out what is the relationship among the three? I guess especially with thinking about the mono no oware and the, as far as I remember from my studies in graduate school, I mean, it is defining a kind of distinctly Japanese emotion with a kind of nationalist project, right? Is that correct?
We now see it that way because Motoori was interested in the Shinto religion, and the Shinto religion was used in World War II. And so any studies of Motoori from post-World War II see him as a nationalist through the light, more negatively than he was seen at the time. But he was still, he wanted to define the character of Japan. That is true. That was his project. Yeah.
So I guess the other two, right? So your proposal and the Doi's proposal, would that, the counter proposals for the character or the emotional character, or is it that they're now part of the picture, or what's the relationship?
Yeah, and for purposes of time, I didn't read my final paragraph that would have talked a little bit about this, but I think the concept in my mind, the largest concept here is that our methodology is going to have a huge impact in what will be the result, what we see when we go looking for emotions. And if we take these three different approaches, we kind of come out at the other end in relatively different ways. But as a through line on all of them is the idea that the culture is going to kind of have the lead in what we will arrive at as understanding what an emotion is. And that Motoori is a scholar with a particular makeup, with a particular agenda. And so he sees mono no ware. And then actually, honestly, everyone did. And still does. Ever since then, we think of Genji as the mono no ware text. But we didn't before he said that. It was just a Buddhist text that showed that if you act in bad ways, you're going to die. And so, but he elevated it in that way. David's got his hand up, so I'm going to stop there.
Yes, John, did I have the camera on? No, now it goes on. Thank you so much for this. I was just wondering whether amae is at all gendered as in Japanese culture, this sense of projecting a certain vulnerability. Is it, I mean, Genji is not only extremely handsome, he's young. And does that factor in attracting this sense of someone else caring for you?
Yeah, this whole period of literature, it has been, one folklorist said, it's a feminine literature, that you have to interpret it as a feminine literature. And Mishima Yukio, who was a contemporary novelist, thought that this was a bad part of Japan. He was kind of a hyper macho type, and he felt we should stop thinking about this period of literature. We could go to earlier literature, which talked about male bravery and honesty and straightforwardness. And the literature after this, which is military tales, focuses a lot on that as well. So it has to do in part with this particular window. But it is interesting that a woman writing for women, when she wants to present exceptionally handsome men, they are very feminine. It's very difficult to tell the difference between a man and a woman in these texts. They all have the same motive range for this period of time. And in today too, there's the feminine men are now at their high point in modern Japanese culture, I think, once again.
I would only add that in classical Greek culture, there's something very similar. I often point out to my students that women fall in love not with he-men, but with boys, pallid, pretty, but not the great warriors. You won't find anybody falling in love with Hector or Ajax, but they will fall in love with Paris, who is pretty and an inferior warrior, pervasive in ancient Greek conceptions.
Okay, we've got two questions in the Q&A. So the first by anonymous attendee. The dependency of Japanese women on the whims of men seems like an almost universal issue. How is it particular or manifest in Japanese society?
Ooh, I'm trying to see if I can nail down a difference here. I would say that the main thing I feel, the friction I feel when I teach this literature to contemporary students is the passivity of the women once they were in these sorts of situations. They never seem to really try to do much of anything except redirect a little bit this way and that way, whatever the desire of the man is doing to them. And so I feel that the situation is not an unusual situation, but the willingness of the women to it would never occur to them that it could be anything but this situation. I think that feels pre-modern rather than, it certainly is obviously pre-modern across cultures, I think, but it's particularly so, I think, in these texts where to be in that situation is attractive to both the men and to other women. It's also hard, but it is also attractive to some degree. And I find that to be maybe more specific to that time. But yes, anyone who has to live at the whims of other people is in a very, very difficult situation. But maybe we all have to live to some degree at the whims of other people. That's really not fair. There's differences, but we all are in this together.
Okay, and then the second question is, I guess it was about Amai, right? Were you saying it was the man who did not want to give back love? That's a clarification.
Yeah, they're both, no, it's interesting that it's a functional relationship because both sides will approach the relationship as the one in need. And so it'll be a back and forth and a back and forth of the two people taking care of each other. And to act as if you do not need your partner would be read at that time as a signal that you do not love your partner. You have to express need because you have to express vulnerability. Otherwise, you're seen as distant and not intimate enough and ready to dump whoever is around you. So it's a two-way street. And give back love is a really interesting phrase because it's like both sides are receiving love with nobody giving love, but that somehow works. And I in one of the memoirs, she's dying and he doesn't go visit her. And you're thinking like, at least can you go visit her? He finally doesn't say, hey, I built a new house and I'm going to put a different wife in it than you. And it's like, even at that sort of time when she really needs something, you know, he's cut the relationship. It's not going to happen. Yeah.
Okay, are there any final questions? All right, then. Well, thank you so much, John, for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
And I now will introduce our next speaker, who is Professor Margaret Jaques, who is a specialist in the languages and religions of ancient Mesopotamia. Professor Jaques is based in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Zurich, where she is professor of the ancient Near East and of comparative history of religion. Professor Jaques received her PhD in the history of religions at the University of Geneva with a thesis on the vocabulary of emotions in Sumerian and Akkadian. She completed her habilitation at the University of Zurich in ancient Near Eastern and comparative history of religion with a book on Sumerian and Akkadian penitential prayers to the personal gods and the study of private piety in Mesopotamia. She's completed research stays in Berlin, London, and Damascus, and has held positions in Innsbruck, Paris, and Geneva prior to taking up her current position at the University of Zurich. So Professor Jaques is the author of numerous publications on emotions in both Sumerian and Akkadian, and today she will be speaking about emotions in Sumerian sources.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank David Constant and Curie Virág for her invitation or their invitation. And I would like also to thank AKKADIAN for her support. I'm sorry for my bad English, and I hope you understand. So, Sumer is a region in today's southern Iraq. It extends roughly from Baghdad to the Diyal regions to the mouth of the Euphrates and the Tigris River in the Persian Gulf. Considering that in early antiquity, the sea coast ran much further north and the Euphrates and the Tigris River were flowing separately. The Sumerians represent the first historically tangible population in southern Mesopotamia. They founded around 12 cities. They are attested in Mesopotamia around 3300 BC. The Sumerian language is a linguistic isolate, that is, it could not until today be attached to a known family of languages. It is neither Semitic nor Indo-European. The difficulty of studying Sumerian emotions are the following. Most Sumerian tablets are fragmentary or in poor condition. Fortunately, many texts were part of the school curriculum, and there are many duplicates, which sometimes broadly, there are two types of texts. Text describing realia, such as royal inscription, which describes constructions and military campaigns, and narrative texts that make use of poetical and when it is mentioned, for example, the lapis lazuli, for example, it is not always clear whether it is meant actual lapis lazuli or if it is a metaphor for something else, like an image of a temple. So it is necessary to ask ourselves what kind of information on emotion is provided by different text genres in different times. The source comes from three types of text: narrative text, lexical list, kinds of glossaries, and royal inscriptions. The three types of sources do not have the same structure or the same goals, and the information they yield is varied and complementary. In the lexical list, there is no specific list of emotion for emotion terms. There is no generic term for emotion, and there is no study on emotion made by the Sumerians themselves. The expression of found in royal inscriptions, the emotion and formal expressions of feelings in specific occasion rather than actually experience emotion. And this expressions are sometimes difficult to analyze because they do not correspond to modern emotions. And sometimes there is no reason for the expression of emotions. In narrative text and royal inscriptions, emotions terms appear with agents, gods and demons, kings, humans, animals, objects, and abstract notions. In 2006, I published a PhD on the vocabulary of feelings, that is meta-language used to speak about. It is a philological study not restricted on the Sumerian text. Before that time, there were no overall study on emotion in the ancient Near East. What is the interest of Sumerian emotion terms? Sumerian is an ergative language. The subject of an intransitive sentence behaves like the object of a transitive sentence and differently from the agent of a transitive verb. The king, in the sentence "the king sits," is not identical to the agent of the sentence "the king reads a text." Examples of ergative languages are Basque, in Europe, Maya, native Australian language like Djirbal, the only syntactic ergative language, and Native American languages. Grammar of ergative conjugation. Indirect conjugation concerns, in addition to verbs of emotion, verbs of needs, such as to need, to be hungry, to desire, to think, to know, to believe. It expresses a state of emotion, of perception, of need. In Sumerian, verbs of emotion are often used with a commutative prefix. Other verbs, such as love, are, however, constructed indirectly with the dative, human object, and the directive for non-human objects. The function of the commutative is very rich. Among other things, it means with, which is the primary function of the commutative. Habilitative, to be able to do the action signified by the verb in a modal function, and various support functions, mutual and reciprocal activities. So the reason of my dissertation was to study the grammatical aspects of emotional sentences. I would like to focus first to the situation of an emotion or emotional expression involving body parts terms. Ulrike Steinert, in the recent Routledge Handbook of Emotion in the Ancient Near East, has argued, with right, that the body parts indicate location, through which emotions are felt, expressed, or manifested. The inside of the body, belly, heart, is the seat of feelings via distinctive signs and symptoms, while the head play a prominent role in communicating and expressing inner feelings. There is no reason not to believe that the inner body was and still is the seat of emotion. Indeed, the brain, even if the source of emotion, does not react as strongly as the heart or the belly to an emotion. But the presence of specific body part like the heart is not essential to the meaning of Sumerian compounds. For example, the term joy can be combined with heart, but this combination appears not to be not a location, but an emphatic specialization. It means literally the joyful heart or the great joy. The word heart could in principle be substituted by any other body parts like liver, entrails, belly, or by the reflexive pronouns. Justly a joyful heart and not, oh my gosh, and not the joy in the heart, or like the translation in Akkadian, the joy of the heart. If you would have a genitive or construction, it would be the heart of joy in Sumerian, not the joy of the heart. We can find expression with the addition of other body parts, and this addition is not necessary to the meaning of emotion. For example, the one who made tears overflow in my eyes iris. Some terms are not emotion terms, but becomes emotion terms when combined with a body part. Sang-3, for example, means alone to strike, to beat, but with heart, it takes the meaning to be afflicted. Translated in Akkadian by, again, a genitive composition to be the burning of the heart. This by Andrew Burlingame, anatomical conceptualizations. It is also attested in Ugaritic emotion terms. In a number of cases, the principal argument of the emotional predicates is not a human or divine entity, but an anatomical feature of the entity, like the spine, the breast, the liver, the back muscle, the heart, the forehead, the brow, the throat, the temple, the face, the feet, the vertebrae. Among these, the heart is by far the more frequently used. In Sumerian and in Akkadian, hate, but also love and joy, appear in opposite context. I quote, the king who loved justice and who hate hostility. These contexts are literal or metaphorical. In a recent study of hate, Andrew Riley, in a book entitled Diving on Human Hate in Ancient Near East, a lexical and contextual analysis, adopts the method of meaning continuum developed by David Aaron. Riley, after Aaron, suggests that there is no binary opposition between literal and metaphorical meaning, but rather a gradient. The method consists in interpreting emotion on a continuous line of meaning between two opposite poles. On the one hand, the literal emotional emotion, and on the other, the metaphorical lexem, that is, the absence of emotions. For Riley, hate in Mesopotamian and biblical texts appears at 3 points on this continuum: literal hatred with negative emotional connotation, metaphorical hatred without emotion, and hatred between the two extremes, emotional and metaphorical, ethical and moral emotion. He underlies that he is not replacing a binary categorization with another three-sided one, but is trying to place graduation on a continuous line of meaning. To be literal, hate must be accompanied by an expression of hostility, physical aggression, or negative feelings towards the hated object. Literal hatred also occurs in hateful speech, where the Sumerian adjective hated can be replaced by the words like bad and taboo. I quote, "Tremble, you are a disease for everyone, an object of hatred for the colleagues, a malicious individual, a net of hostility, a spiteful mouth, a cheeky face, someone with a deceitful tongue." Metaphorical hatred is not an emotional experience. In these contexts, hate belongs to the legal vocabulary, just as love and joy in convenient contract. Riley concludes that hate in the ancient Near East is different from its modern meaning because hate today is always emotional. I quote, "He deflawed her. After he had deflawed her, he hated her." Another one, "Righteous shepherd who rejoiced in justice. His decrees are magnificence that rejoice the heart. His verdict is a very great thing." Joy is the most representative emotion in our corpus. There is in Sumerian a terminus technicus for joy, rule 2, and other terms describing different types of emotions of time of joyful context. It ranged from simple individual satisfaction to the joy of communal celebrations like feasts, dances, and songs. Related terms can also describe the somatic sensation of joy in response to a stimulus, sensation of dilatation, pleasure, cries of joy, laugh, illumination of the face. Joy also appeared parallel to praises and prayers to the god. Joy is corollary to appeasement and compassion and opposite to anger. Joy is also linked with a good and healthy relationship with the gods. I quote, "To install a luminous heart in the center of the houses of the pious one, not to install good humor in the houses of the impious ones. This is in the power of Inanna." Are also very numerous in the Sumerian corpus, but there is no terminus technicus for anger, and terms are either synonymous or they are used in different specific rituals, kings, or demons as agent. Riley suggested there's an opposition between hate, that is an emotion that implies a violation of contract or alliance, divorce, family or political alliance, and anger. Hate would be an emotion of justice, that is turning away from somebody, while anger would be a warlike emotion turning against somebody. Example of anger, for example, a moral question concerning anger: what does man do out of anger? Inanna is not only the goddess of love, she is also the goddess of war, who can become terribly angry against the king, but mostly the foreign kings. Having become angry, unleashing her fury, Inanna pronounced a terribly curse against him. Anger also often appears in prayers and laments. His anger, the anger of the god, is burning coals that inflame the body. The vocabulary of joy and anger is very frequent, indicating its importance in the corpus. But these are found as early dynastic, that is earlier than the second millennium BC, and are very frequent in the text of all periods. Example of love: this is game that has been joyfully established, a mutual love, a pleasure you cannot get enough of. Love and hate appear in polarity, in proverb, for example: a loving heart builds houses, a hating heart destroyed houses. Love appears very often in the relationship between the god and the king, Lipitischer, a king, favorite of Enlil, whom Ninlil loves. This is both gods, most important gods of the Sumerian pantheon. Are we to understand that the term hate, love, and joy themselves, in a sense, have a plus or minus meaning on a gradient? Or is it a question how they are applied or used in context? It seems to me that ancient emotion terms may not be less emotional in their contractual use, but that it is their usage that are plus or minus on the continuum. And even so, the use of a term of emotion and not another administrative term might reinforce the idea of loyalty and commitment in alliances, or of a betrayal in the case of breach. If hate means always hate, whatever its usage, it has to be understood in contract as strong reject. The use of hate implies the idea of repulsion, which is related to that of hostility. The same must appear with love, because in the parallelism with terms like because of the parallelism with terms like brother or friends in contract, it shows that it is a kind of attachment. The method of meaning continuum allows a softer representation of emotion than the binary explanation, but it does not solve all the problem met with the Sumerian emotion terms. It's problematic because no word in English corresponds exactly to the Sumerian term. Sadness, affliction, and trouble. According to its context, generally designated by manifestations rather than by an abstract note. Texts mention tears, sobbing, complaints, and lamentations. Even the word anir, which might be a word for sadness, appear frequently with the meaning ritual lamentation. I quote, "A song in the warehouse. His young daughter weeps. His young man weeps tears bitterly." People crying the death of Dumuzi. Dumuzi is the lover of Inanna, and praying his divine sister Geshinana are mentioned in many lamentations. Now, I quote, "Now your brother has turned into a man full of sorrow. No, Dumuzi has turned into a man full of desolation." The world before creation is described as a golden age, a state of heavenly happiness. I quote, "At that time, the snake did not exist. The scorpion did not exist. The hyena did not exist. The lion did not exist. The dog and the wolf did not exist. Fear, Nite, and terror, Susi, did not exist. Mankind had no opponent. To describe the period before creation, the paradise-like state, the negative form is used. It is a time where certain things are absent. There is no predators, no opponents, no wars, no conflicts, no disease, no age, no fears. The study of the words that mean fear show that the Sumerians distinguish two types of fear. It is first the tremendum, the respectful fear toward an hierarchical superior, and in particular to the god, towards the gods and the king. And then you have the dread, the terror, reflected by Zürich, a compound that is a description of the effect of fear on the body. It literally means to have goosebumps, to have hair put up on the skin, and is similarly translated into Akkadian, but is also translated by the term shalumatu in Akkadian, meaning frightening radiance. For Darwin, as for Ekman, fear is a primary emotion that has a close relationship to the body. The first composite verb take for respectful fear is frequently attested in the royal epithets. We speak then of the prince or the shepherd who feels respectful fear towards gods. The second word, Susie, is never used in a royal epithet, but the Akkadian translation by Shalumatu, frightening radiance, brings, however, also an ominous sense, to use this Latinized synonym of divinatory, because brightness, the luminous, is associated with the gods. The two words for fears, absent before the creation of the universe, are thus linked to the fear of the gods. It is not a spontaneous or reactive fear in front of a danger. These words describe a reasoned feeling, even a figuration of emotion, a type of exemplary emotion associated with an attitude. Associated with fear is a verb to startle, used especially in a very difficult sentence, the reaction or waking up. The shepherd lay down. He lay down to dream. He woke a dream. He shivered. It was asleep. He rubbed his eyes. He was terrified. This work, Nick Megar, have been tentatively tried to translate it as terrified, is a very difficult word because it has been translated in two ways. One with prostration, stupor, depression, and on the other end, with joy. So we don't know. Is it joy? Is it prostration? It is extremely difficult and needs more research. Okay, Sumerian emotion, envy and jealousy. The lonely term ninim, it is very rarely attested. Jealousy is close to Morgoth 3, anger, for two reasons. First, ninim is written with the logogram representing heart combined with fire. And Morgoth 3 is written with the logogram mouth combined with fire. In the lexical list, ninim follows word to quarrel, which indicates that jealousy is not only linked to anger, but also to contempt and insult. I quote, and so Winter became jealous and entered into confrontation with Sumer. The prayer, the request for compassion, is the only way to regain status and honor. The expectation of people is compassion and forgiveness on the part of the king and the gods. In Sumerian narrative text and prayers, but also in personal names, it is God who are the most often asked for pity. The expression to have compassion for someone is used in prayer in parallel with a request for appeasement of divine anger. The Sumerian word arush may be related to the Akkadian word rarashu, said of woman in childbirth. The first meaning of Sumerian harush could be approximately womb. Compassion would be understood as a kind of rebirth, the creation of a new person. I quote, "You will fight the sleep of your eyes for the fulfillment of his worship. Because of your watchfulness, he will be more indulgent toward you." The title indulgence, full of compassion, is usually affixed to name of goddesses and often parallel epithet relating to prayer. Goddess, I quote, "Goddess, mother of the land, who has compassion, who loves worship, who lends an ear to prayer." Example of shame, arrogance, shame, contempt, or pride. Arrogance and pride, who has been quoted by Emily Odell yesterday, are certainly attested in the Sumerian vocabulary, but are difficult to distinguish from terms of magnificence and power, and from anger and hate. I would like instead to focus on the term for shame. Shame is teshtu. There is a general claim that all emotions encapsulate form or reflexivity insofar as they are intentionally directed toward the subject who considered to be the particular object of emotions. Sumerian emotion terms are not used or not often used in negative sentences. One cannot find, "I don't like this," but instead, "I hate this." A sentence containing a term of emotion is therefore almost always positive, and one can wonder if emotion terms are not a disposition or a quality describing someone or something, and less a reactive mechanism like in modern languages. When emotion appears mostly in a negative sentence, it is a term that we translate with shame. Tesh is often attested in negative sentence with the verb to have or to know, and means therefore to have no tesh or to know no tesh, to have no shame or to know no shame. In the instruction of Shurbach and in the debate poem Bird and Fish, there is a link between lack of shame and lack of intelligence. Both lead to disgrace. Someone without intelligence decides a fate. Someone without shame pours something into the lap of a man. Here I am truly, so he stands for the astonishment of people. More clear, a bird that knows no shame, scattering his droppings all over the yard. These lines show that a person or an animal is expected to be modest in his social environment. With modesty, shame can be avoided. However, shame is not just a social feeling. It results from a person feeling inadequacy in relation to moral, intellectual, or aesthetic value that the person considers essential and self-defining. In this sense, shame has an individualization character. If these values, which one considers self-defining, even if they are social, are undermined, one risks not being able to recognize oneself. I'm almost finished. Moreover, tesh is not only considered as an emotion or abstract concept, it is also a personified life force, dignity. Tesh appears in various texts alongside the personal protective deities Lama and Udu. In this, it has a positive meaning. I will jump a little bit. To sum up, Tesh is an emotion, shame, a notion of the self, and a protective spirit, a kind of soul. This inner and outer soul has a regulation function. It holds a conversation with the individual and enables him to control his daily behavior according to religious principle. The Sumerians distinguish shame and guilt. Shame and guilt do not appear in the same context. Shame is mostly found in narrative text, hymns, and incantation, whereas guilt is attested frequently in prayer and lamentations. In this text, there are numerous parallel terms for fault, taboo, and guilt. The term namtag for guilt is attested in the royal inscription of Gina around 2500 BC, so that the idea of guilt is as old as the concept of shame and not an Akkadian invention as it has been supposed. It is interesting that the Sumerians use shame without a particular object. They do not say John is ashamed of his big feet. They only say the people who has no shame. This usage reflexivity does not surface, but it is grammatically correct to insert in these sentences an explicit reflexive component. Today we report shame episode by saying John is ashamed of his big feet, but this construction can easily be completed in the following fashion. John is ashamed of himself because of his big feet. If we transfer this remark to the Sumerian, it is possible to complete they have no shame by they are not ashamed of themselves because of their bad manners. A sense of guilt is a reaction to other people's criticism, so it requires a real or imaginary audience. This audience is in Mesopotamia, the human society and the community of the gods, with their laws and religious obligations. Conclusion. Context in Akkadian allows to group many Sumerian terms under the abstract. Among these terms, some are used very frequently, others more rarely or even exceptionally. It depends on the type of text, mainly narrative, in which they are tested. An important aspect of Sumerian term is the use of body parts, especially the heart, which we comprehended always as a location, but also as to emphasize the meaning of an emotion term. Riley has proposed to study hate with a method named meaning continuum. We have shown that it worked with the term of joy, hate, and love, but this method is more difficult to apply with other emotion terms. After presenting the more attested Sumerian corpus, we have focused on the term of shame. It has a complex meaning. It is first a negative sense. It is used in negative sentence, that is with a negative prefix. It is both an emotion and a quality. It means also at the same time the self of the individual and a deified entity, a personified property and an objectified principle. Okay, the relationship between emotion and the self must be, of course, go deeper than the requirement that there be a subject who undergoes them. That is, that they are anchored in somebody's psychological life. There is a more intimate relation between a subject and its emotion. What could this emotion be? Since a fundamental feature of more psychological state is that they aim at or are about something, there are intentional states. The answer one may give to this question depends on the kind of intentionality that emotions have. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this fascinating journey through the world of Sumerian emotions. We caught most of it. There's a little bit of breaking, but I think we caught most of it. Thank you so much. I think we already have one question in the chat. It's a question that is about, would you say our emotions have not evolved very much, I guess, based on the accounts that you...
Yes, it depends on the text, because most of the texts where you have emotion words are Old Babylonians. So I would say that in Old Babylonian times, because the society was becoming very complex, and because of the Akkadian influence, they decided to build new words of emotions to describe their world, actually, their emotions and so on. And this is why some terms appear in Old Babylonian terms, in Old Babylonian times.
Okay.
But I think, yes, they have been evolving.
Professor Jaques, do you think you could put your camera back on? It might be okay now. It'd be great to see you during the Q&A. Thank you. Okay, so David Constant.
I'm joining the conversation. There we go. I was particularly struck by your comment about the reciprocity of emotions, if I understood correctly, that emotions in the Sumerian vocabulary tend to involve other people. You feel an emotion before, toward another person. And I am struck by it because it is my conception to a large extent of ancient Greek ways of looking at emotions, that they're almost invariably in a social context. Even the emotion we might think of as most likely to be directed toward objects, and by that I mean fear, because you can be afraid of a thing that might damage you. But in Greek way of thinking, what you normally fear is people who are hostile. And so even there, it's not just danger in the abstract, but danger due to hostility. And if there is such a connection, might it have anything to do with the ergative nature of Sumerian?
Oh, this is difficult to say. You would say that it is always a transitive kind of sentence. Not always. I want to say that sometimes they have fear without having an object, a particular object. But you can reconstruct the particular object, because if you know how they use the terms in other circumstances, you know that when they use fear, for example, it is most of the times, the fear of God. But they can have fear of animals, the fear of lions, and so on. So, you know, they are intuitively always an object of fear. But even if they don't say, you can reconstruct it. But as Mrs. Odell said, three emotions are more reflexive. This means shame, arrogance, and pride are reflexive emotions directed not to an object external, but to an object which is the subject's self, the self actually. And that is the interest of these three emotions. Most of the other emotions are directed to are non-reflexive emotion and directed to an external object.
Here we have another question, Gina.
Thank you so much for your talk. I wondered if you had any thoughts if there are emotions we see in Sumerian that we don't necessarily see as much from the gods as opposed to more human figures. In Akkadian, we certainly see both gods and men be afraid when they can't confront Tiamat or Anzu, but it seems like we get less of that nature of text in Sumerian literature in particular.
Well, you have fear of animals, and you have fear, as I told you, Suzik, for example, or different words can be also a fear of something completely real, not godly, not divine. Khulur, for example, which is startled, to be scared of dreams, are not exactly a divine emotion. So I'm sure you have other kind of emotion with agent and object who are human or animals or abstract notions. It's not necessary with gods. But when you have these words "need to," combined with a verb, need to. It means something divine. It means something abstract, very abstract, and need to become the meaning of need to is self, actually. It is not exactly, so it is linked to the gods somehow.
Okay, thank you so much for your talk and for answering our questions. So now we move on to our final speaker, Professor Gina Konstantopoulos, who is a specialist in Assyriology and cuneiform studies in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures at UCLA. Her research centers on religion, magic, and literature in Mesopotamia, with a particular focus on the role of demons and monsters in Sumerian and Akkadian texts. Her current research is on the creation of distant and imagined lands and notions of space and place in the ancient Near East, particularly the intersection of distant space and empire in the first millennium BC. So Professor Konstantopoulos will be speaking to us about emotions in Akkadian.
So the standard, everybody sees my slides. All right, take silence as agreement. So I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers of this really lovely workshop, as well as all of my fellow speakers. It's been a really wonderful 2 days. And with that, I will get right into it. So the Epic of Gilgamesh stands as arguably the most famous text from ancient Mesopotamia, and is perhaps the only text to have achieved anything akin to a popular familiarity and acclaim. I say this with the caveat that this is, the fondness of mostly Nordic death metal bands for a range of Mesopotamian creation myths, including the Akkadian Enuma Elish notwithstanding. But for all its popularity, when one steps back, Gilgamesh is a rather strange text in many ways. In its first millennium, or standard Babylonian form, it is comprised of 12 tablets. The first half of the narrative follows something like an adventure story. Gilgamesh and his companion Enkidu journey forth and are victorious in battle against both monstrous Humbaba and the Bull of Heaven. It is after these triumphs, however, that things go quite awry. In tablet 7, Enkidu sickens and dies, and Gilgamesh spends the next tablet mourning his lost companion. He holds his fallen friend's body for 7 days and nights until it begins to physically decompose. His grief carries him into the next tablet of the text, which opens with his continued sorrow. For his friend Enkidu, Gilgamesh was weeping bitterly as he roamed the wild. I shall die, and shall I not then be like Enkidu? Sorrow has entered my heart. I became afraid of death, and so go roaming the wild. Gilgamesh is driven by grief, and moreover, the awareness that he too is mortal, so grief and a fear of death in turn. In essence, Enkidu's death bifurcates the narrative of the epic. The first half may operate as an adventure story, but the latter half is a deeply emotional and even introspective tale, focused rather entirely on Gilgamesh and his own grief, as well as his recognition and thus fear of his own inevitable mortality. Now, as has been noted already by Martin Worthington, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, or rather in the epic, Gilgamesh only refers to Enkidu by Enkidu's name after the latter's death. Prior to this, Enkidu is introduced with the term Ibri, my friend or my companion, but the first words Gilgamesh speaks following Enkidu's death is Enkidu's own name, called out in mourning and grief. Thus, even a subtle marker in the text may indicate the expression of emotions. We see this as well in Gilgamesh's own increasingly wild and unkept state. In life, Enkidu, shaped from clay in the steppe, was the wild one, but Gilgamesh now mourns, or rather mirrors, the now lost Enkidu during his wanderings, to such a degree that when he finally does encounter others, essentially he travels to the end of the world and finds a barmaid running a tavern at the edge of the universe, more or less. He is unrecognizable to some degree as a person, let alone a king. So these examples, centered again on one particular text, already highlight some of the difficulties in studying emotions in Akkadian, as well as in cuneiform literature as a whole. The expression of emotions can be bold, represented by acts of weeping, or the invocation of sorrow. and no one could certainly claim that Gilgamesh is subtle, but they can also manifest in the text through, indeed, very subtle ways. There are, of course, other issues. When we consider emotions broadly in Akkadian, we encounter some categorical concerns, many of which have already been expressed in other presentations on the languages of the ancient Near East. As has been aptly summarized in an article by Janine Venda on the emotions in Akkadian, which appeared this year in the Routledge Handbook of Emotions in the Ancient Near East, there is no Akkadian noun for the overarching terms emotion or feeling, and no verb meaning to feel. Instead, as we've already heard, expression of emotions is linked to the body, especially the heart, liver, belly, inside, guts, and flesh. As a result of the strong association of physical and emotional experiences, it is simply not possible to sensibly differentiate between emotion, affect, and feeling. And of course, we've already seen this in even the examples I have just shown. Gilgamesh localizes his sorrow within his heart, for example, and weeps bitterly. The most straightforward expression of emotion, quote unquote, in this excerpt might well be fear, which is governed by the verb here, palachu. For all that his fear is of death itself, something that is both abstract and will prove to be inevitable. So within the context of literature, including cuneiform texts, work on emotion is often focused on what emotions in the text may mean to invoke or induce in its audience. As summarized by scholar Laura Felt, the field of research discussing emotions in stories looks at the ways in which stories simulate emotions through characters, narrators, and events, and how stories occasionally comment on affective processes on a meta level. Now, such research is, as most of us are already aware, tied in turn to recent studies in cognitive science, often following under the general turn of, or umbrella term of, the emotional turn in scholarship. This work focuses generally on how literary works create emotion in the reader, which is not necessarily identical to the emotions found within the text or those experienced by its central characters. However, the interior emotions of the text and the exterior emotions experienced by its audience cannot, nor should not, be entirely divorced from one another. The impact of effective narratology is facilitated through processes of mirroring and sympathy. The reader responds to the most powerful emotions in the text and may indeed experience those same emotions. When Gilgamesh mourns his fallen friend Enkidu, we as the audience, the modern audience that is to say, may experience an echo of those emotions. So while we cannot equalize or equate the emotions of actor and audience with each other, nor should we necessarily dismiss them, or rather their relationship to each other. In truth, the standpoint of emotions, particularly emotions in an area as distant as Mesopotamia, must, as has already been stated, be understood within the specific cultural context from which the example under study originated. So all of that said, I will now turn to much more the task at hand, an investigation of the different major emotions themselves in Akkadian. Here I'm going to leave a few out with apologies, and in the limitations of time, I'll look particularly at examples of love and joy, rage and hate, fear, and then sorrow and grief as four respective and representative groupings. In each instance, I'll provide a brief summary, drawing again in terms of the vocabulary work on what has already been done in more detail by Vende in her overview of Akkadian terms for the particular emotions, and then considering several examples that illustrate how the emotion may manifest or be represented in texts. So let's start with happy emotions. Despite this, however, I'm still going to use Gilgamesh as a way in, because we do see that he invokes here one of the key terms used to describe love. In Mourning Enkidu, he highlights how close his relationship was by stating how my friend whom I love has turned to clay, before lamenting that he may in turn someday meet the same fate. So in his phrase of Sha'aramu, we find the verb ramu, which is the word most often used for love. This is employed for love of all kinds. For example, though scholarship on the epic has in the past debated the nature of Gilgamesh and Enkidu's relationship, the salient detail for such debates was not Gilgamesh's use of Ramu to describe his connection to Enkidu, but rather the early descriptions in the text that he would love Enkidu, quote, like a wife, among a number of other points. Among the other vocabulary used for love and affection, we also find hababu, which describes an action of flittering or twittering about, sometimes used to detail birds or other animals. When paired with the heart in particular, it provides the sense of a heart fluttering with affection. Now, as has already been described in the previous talk, many words for love and happiness, as well as emotions as a whole, are paired with body parts, particularly the libu, or heart in particular. So here we find the verb hadu, to be happy or content, tabu, to be well or good, and rashu, or to rejoice, which appears more often standalone. In addition to these, the verb elesu and habasu have the literal, though less often used, meanings of to swell or be abundant, but may appear with the heart or the face to describe happiness, or a face shining with joy, a phrase or expression we will see in just a bit. So we see both formulaic, and this is primarily seen in royal inscriptions of Assyrian kings in particular, and more unique and specific uses of these terms. So the gods may be described as those who love the king and his kingship, Raimute Sharutika, as you see in the first example. The protection of deities may be directly inferred and implied by describing them as those who love you, as in the second. And this is further bolstered by positioning the female deities here as in a maternal relationship with the king. Servants and vassals of the king may be required to profess not just their loyalty, but also their love to the present, or in this case, as this example is taken for Esarhaddon's succession treaty, future ruler. And the king may be described as displaying his love for his people in turn, as seen in the fourth. Here, however, interestingly, we find that description of kindness and love folded into a petition of the king, in this instance from the still in favor exorcist, Arachumurusur, on behalf of his no longer favored son, Uradgulu, who just has an unfortunate series of events as a disgraced individual. Now, falling out of the king's favor was unsurprisingly a dire fate, and this is far from the only instance where the disgraced individual pleads for the king's mercy. This is an example from an unknown writer, again from the Neo-Assyrian period, who proclaims how his heart is entirely devoted to his lord and begs the king to have mercy, even on him, phrasing himself even as the king's dog. The disgraced individual pleads for the king's mercy as a supplicant, but we also see instances where one may attempt a more forceful elicitation of affections. Though relatively rare, particularly when compared to Greek material, we have a number of literary texts and incantations that would be considered love magic, designed to create or redirect feelings of affection in the intended target. Here in this Old Babylonian text, the male querent asks that love come to him flittering about. The incantation of love is intended for the female object of his affections, and these texts don't always, by the way, have a male querent and female object. But here we have an incantation that is intended for her to disregard all of her existing familial connections. Now, this text is relatively unusual, but we find the language of happiness and love seen in another, somewhat more standard incantation. This one here designed to counter witchcraft, divine wrath, and a host of other ills that could trouble you. So much of this ritual focuses on the use of magical stones and plants, but we find within it an embedded incantation wherein the gods themselves decree that the afflicted patient shall be walking about shining and radiant with joy, reinforcing throughout the connection between emotions of joy and happiness and the image of a shining, beaming face and bright countenance. So, having looked at happy emotions, let's turn to angry ones. This is going to be a regrettably brief consideration of the negative counterparts of joy and happiness, namely anger, rage, and hate. In terms of vocabulary, we find some direct parallels. Ramu is opposed by the verb zeru, to hate. Although deities may express love, they much less often hate or directly hate via zeru. They generally show rage or anger instead. Now, verbs for hate, namely lemenu, to be bad or malevolent, and marasu, to be ill, appear in this context when they are paired with the heart. When we consider anger and rage, we similarly have verbs that carry more direct connotations of a raging countenance or a fierce figure. The verb azezu often appears as the derived adjective ezu and is assigned to demons and other terrifying beings. Now we find, of course, other ways, interesting ways of depicting hate and anger in Akkadian, as seen in letters and political correspondence, for example. Here, the intrigue and jockeying for favor between palace scribes is described by one as how he makes him out, i.e. his rival, to be more hateful to him, and has now regarded him, the individual in question, as a mortal enemy. Bel Dameshu, literally the lord of his blood, sort of a sworn foe. In other instances, we find the use of the expected Zeru, but with more colorful applications. In the first example, taken from an unfortunately broken letter, so we don't know who's sending it, one individual describes, or his behavior is described as how he hates all that brings rejoicing. In the second, rituals for a king or the king are detailed, and one scholar laments that another group that is not part of this elite and restricted group, specifically the scholars of the inner palace, the inner city rather, are unable to advise the king, but yet they still hatefully advise him, not knowing their own rights, which are not recorded, and are ill-disposed towards this one second group. So there's a lot going on here that hints to the use of these terms in a political context. So from hate, keep somewhat on brand and move to fear. And this is the emotion I'll devote the most detail to in my talk, in part because we have an interesting range of semantic terms that govern fear, and also because it happens to be an area of focus for my own research at present. So we find a detailed and rich range of terms to describe fear as an emotional condition. And here, though I focus on Akkadian terms in my talk, here we go. Nope, there we go. I do actually want to reference work by the previous presenter, so Jaques, to highlight that we are dealing, of course, with Akkadian terms that overlap with Sumerian vocabulary, something that remains a point of interest. So we can see the overlap between a number of these terms as has already been discussed. So along the wide range of Akkadian terms that are used to describe fear, 5 in particular are seen most often, particularly in the targeted corpus of Assyrian royal inscriptions. A study by scholars at the University of Helsinki, published in 2021, identified these 5 verbs as such: palahu, shahatu, adaru, galatu, and paradu. Now, these terms may indicate the presence or absence of fear, as seen in the epithet of one being la adiru to Kunti, or fearless in battle. We see some semantic overlap between the various terms. In another passage, we have the fun declaration of palhaku adratu ushudarakutu, or shuduraku rather, I am frightened, I am afraid, I am terrified. There is a degree of mappable overlap and correlation between the Sumerian and Akkadian terms, and some ambiguity in their uses, but the most critical divide for us lies between palahu and other fear terms, particularly those appearing alongside them like Adara and Galatu. Palahu is in essence fear that is reverent, respectful, and appropriate, fear generated by terror, particularly terror of the divine. So at this point, I would again invoke the work of my fellow panelist, Margaret Jaques, who in a study of the vocabulary of emotion in ancient Mesopotamia, delineated 2 broad categories governing their expression, namely conventional and non-conventional expressions. In the first, we find, quote, an identical and reoccurring expression being compared and inscribed in a chart almost out of context. This in particular is emotion as often expressed in royal inscriptions, formal expressions of feeling on specific occasions. Non-conventional expressions, on the other hand, are more difficult to categorize and must be considered within their own individual contexts. Now, we've already seen some non-conventional expressions, particularly in private letters, but despite the fact we're going to spend a bit of time looking at royal inscriptions, which are conventional expressions, I'd like to take a look at how they might still express particular uses of fear. So, what we also see in the royal inscriptions, of course, is fear that may be employed as a tool. And despite this quite pointed use, fear remains quite instructive. So if we take an initial, very brief look at how fear and terror may be depicted in these standard texts, such as the Assyrian royal inscriptions, namely Esarhaddon's prison, for example, we will certainly find fear, examples of fear as both an emotion and a tool, governed particularly by the verb palahu, appearing, why it's lagging, as the noun paluchtu. Fear of the gods overwhelms Esarhaddon's foes, the gods cause his enemies to fear him and his kingship, and they give Esarhaddon here the trifecta of fierceness, splendor, and radiant awe. Esarhaddon may also himself fear proper respectful fear, again with paluchtu, of the gods. We see this in our third example, where he, out of proper respect and reverence for Babylon's gods, returns lands to the citizens of Babylon. His enemies continue to feel the fear imposed by the gods of Assyria, though. In our fourth instance, we see here, this brings about their immediate capitulation to Esarhaddon. Now, fear via paluchtu is not the only sort of negative fearful emotion that may be employed against his enemies. Several of his foes are also stricken with chatu, which we can see in the edition in Renap here, takes pains to translate as unprovoked fear. This may also carry connotations of panic, as in medical texts. Now, the gods may emanate or cause both paluchtu and chatu, but the former carries implications of respect and awe, and the latter does not. In Esarhaddon's prison, again, his enemies may be afflicted by both coming from divine sources that act on his behalf. Now, divine fear was also associated with the quite literal image of radiance, an aura named Melam, Melim 4 rather, or Melamu, and this is associated with deities, demons, and kings. These is often portrayed as emanating rays that inflict both terror and awe, and Melamu is a concept that helps us kind of reinforce the idea of an externalization and conceptualization of fear, the emotion itself and that which causes it. Through Melamu, fear becomes something quite real and thus manipulatable. We can see this quite clearly in the case of Huwawa, the guardian of the cedar forest. Following his deaths in the Sumerian text at the hand of Gilgamesh and Enkidu, Enlil removes his Melam, installing them in various locations. Now, in material actuality, the face of Huwawa was used epitropeically, placed on the walls of temples. You have two examples here from Tel Arima, or used on a smaller and more household scale. Now, although my focus is on texts, I want to very briefly, an eye on time, diverge to look at how Huwawa's serenely smiling visage highlights for us another aspect of emotion in Akkadian. We can see here how emotions may be expressed artistically. So we find depictions of individuals on cylinder seals from all periods. Here, a Neo-Assyrian example of someone approaching a deity in supplication, and another fun set of individuals confronting ostriches from the Morgan Library, which are just great. Despite the fact that the guy on the bottom is taking an ostrich foot to the gut, he remains very serene. The individuals are depicted in exquisite detail, but they remain without outward emotion. Even in the Assyrian campaign reliefs, there is no outward distinction in the faces of those being killed and those doing the killing. We see here the enemy soldiers being flayed alive on the left and soldiers being stabbed on the right. In another relief, a group hides in a reed thicket from Assyrian soldiers, again calmly and serenely, despite the signs of past battle that surround them, including a floating headless corpse to their immediate right. Even the enemy king Teumon wears the same tranquil expression in the moments before and thereafter following his death. There is, however, an exception to the lack of emotion seen in Mesopotamian, or more specifically Assyrian art, but it occurs not with people but with animals. The lions and the lion hunt reliefs of Ashurbanipal and Ashurnasirpal are portraits of agony, their pain clearly shown in their faces and in their body language. Agony that is expressed both as they die but remains present after they are dead. The repeated images of dead lions present as iterations of agony, and though the lions are the most detailed and expressive figures in these reliefs as such, they are not the only animals to be depicted with emotion. In the reliefs of the king hunting wild asses, for example, we can see the animals depicted with similarly vivid realism as they flee the hunting dogs. Even one of the king's horses, held back by a eunuch, is shown with a tight body and tense, or a tight posture and tense body. And we can clearly contrast these two depictions these types of depictions when the king engages directly with the lions on hunt. Here he thrusts his spear into a lion's gape and opening mouth. Despite the energy of the lion itself, the ruler remains serene, a serenity he keeps, even in depictions where he quite literally defeats a lion with his bare hands. A stark contrast to the lion's own fierce and vivid depiction, nearly bristling with energy. So the final emotion group I'd like to look at today are the emotions of sorrow and grief. Now, these emotions are not always directly expressed in Mesopotamia. The vocabularies of emotion in Akkadian often lack specific words that directly correlate to these feelings. Instead, we see these emotions expressed through actions, with lamentation and mourning serving as key signifiers for the emotions of sorrow and grief, for example. They can be expressed through certain words or certain verbs such as baku to weep, damanu to warn, to wail, nisa to grief, worry, as well as, again, expressions pairing verbs and body parts. So murush libi, sickness of the heart, latub libli literally as the not well heart. Now we can see some of the more oblique references to sorrow again in Gilgamesh's Mourning of Enkidu. In here, this is actually Enkidu's final days. Gilgamesh and Enkidu speak on how those who are left behind when another dies are only left with suffering. Enkidu, however, only asks of Gilgamesh that he be remembered. A task which Gilgamesh certainly strives to fulfill, although one could argue his quest is somewhat self-centered. Following Enkidu's death, Gilgamesh weeps, of course, for his lost friend and commands that others do the same. When he first encounters others after his wanderings, as I have discussed, his appearance is wild and untamed. He is described as having sorrow in his heart, while his face is like one who has traveled a distant road. But just, I would caution, as one emotion can be expressed through multiple avenues, different terms, and a range of imagery and action, even artistic representations, that is to say, so too can the same action and word imply different emotions. So Gilgamesh weeps for Enkidu out of grief and sorrow, or for his own lost immortality later in the text. But Ishtar weeps in rage, again using Baku. When scorned, she demands the bull of heaven from Anu, her father, scorned by Gilgamesh, that is. Other moments of emotional significance may not be directly signaled through emotion, vocabulary, or imagery at all. Expressions of grief are, to me, very interesting because they provide detailed and personal insights into the lives of people in Mesopotamia, even the rulers. Now, Esarhaddon suffered a veritable host of calamities during his reign, and in one letter to his chief exorcist, he seems overcome with sorrow and grief at the recent death of one of his children, who has passed away in infancy. I'm feeling not just sad, but very sad. His sadness is Adonis, it's emphasized, and he has become so depressed here. So he's using the verb shapalu. His heart is literally low. So as I now approach the close of my talk, I would end, still in sorrow, with the brief discussion of one particular text that provides us not only with a depiction of intense emotion from a private individual, but intense emotion from a woman, which allows me to move slightly, although at the end, away from my run of texts by and about men. Moreover, it is an intensely poetic depiction of sorrow and grief from the departed themselves. So I speak of a text known as the Assyrian Elegy, which is a first millennium text excavated at Nineveh from the main mount of Nineveh, which is to say Kuyunjik. It is itself an interesting text. As you can see, it has this particular landscape format and is published by Andrew George in the Festschrift for Professor Foster. And I provide here both the photograph and the hand copy, which really showcases how particularly fine the cuneiform itself is. Now, the text is nearly complete, and the subject of it is a woman who has died in childbirth. It's a particularly well-known text, and it opens with a description of her being questioned by an unknown individual, asking how she is abandoned like a boat in the midst of the river, her mooring ropes cut, her face veiled as she crosses the river in the center of the city. The river in question is one that Andrew George in particular has argued represents the division between the city of the netherworld and that the world inhabited by living beings. The woman proceeds to describe how she has come to meet such a sad fate. In the days she was with child, how joyful, here using hatu, she was, but when her labor pains began, a shadow darkened her face. The days of my birth began, her eyes were hindered. She reaches out in attempted supplication to the birth goddess, the mother goddess in Mesopotamia. She pleads with her to alleviate her pain and moreover her fate, namely her imminent death. But the mother goddess hears her prayer and instead veils her face, not extending to her compassion. Here we unfortunately hit a bit of the broken section, but we can see that her husband cries out in grief and sorrow, and she is summarily taken to the netherworld, where she resides for all eternity. The woman continues to lament, quite poetically, her sad fate. The woman's shade, passing through the streets of the city, gave a wail. Alas, this whole time my husband was my company, with him I dwelled, he who loved me. Then stealthy death to our bedroom crept. From my house he drove me forth. From before my husband he severed me and set my footfall here in a place of no return. So although I fear I have only been able to provide a very cursory look at this evocative text, as well as the broader and complex subject of emotions in Akkadian as a whole, the text nevertheless provides an encapsulation of sorts of many of the points that I hope I have made a case for governing emotions in Akkadian. We find in the elegy a depth of feeling and vivid imagery, as well as a contrast between emotions that are expressed directly through the relevant vocabulary, as with the use of hadu for her once joyful state, and those that are more obliquely invoked, as when the mother goddess refuses to extend her compassion to the laboring woman and so veiled her face. Finally, we see in this text the ways in which emotions are one part, or perhaps one strand, of a web of connected, or rather interconnected references and a larger context. The final imagery here, or final image here, that of death creeping into her once joyful bedroom, is one that invokes depictions of death seen in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The text, as with the emotions in it, can only be fully understood as one part of a larger contextual whole. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gina. That was amazing. That I think I wasn't expecting these texts to say so much. They were so expressive and so rich. Actually, I was at the Morgan Library a few months ago, and I didn't know anything about those seals, and so it was wonderful to hear more about them. I mean, the intricacy of these seals is quite amazing.
A lot of their seals are really beautiful examples. They have some of the most beautiful seals in the collection.
Yeah. I don't see any questions yet. If I could ask a question, I was quite blown away by the depictions of the lions, and especially the contrast, as you say, between how expressive they are and how kind of the humans are so lacking in expression. What do you make of that? What does that tell us? I'm so intrigued.
So it's a really interesting contrast, and I know I'm being this something of an overview. I know I'm not the first person to have pointed it out by far. One of the things, so when I showed the two heads of Teamon, that comes from an article that a scholar, Eva Miller, wrote on depictions of foreigners in the reliefs. And one of the things she pointed out in her overview of this, which is available online in Studio or in Thalia Electronica, it's open source, is that we have this kind of perfected body of particularly the Assyrian king, but also the other individuals that belong to the Assyrian kind of camp and group of figures. So her speculation on this, or her investigation of this, and it's one I sort of wonder about applying to the lions as well, the other animals, is that any deviation from that, what we see in the foreigners, the depictions of the foreigners, is seen as a variation or a variance away from this kind of perfected norm. So my thought on this, applying this idea, is that intense emotion would be seen as a similar variance away from the norm. I mean, it's certainly true that from the earliest stages, we don't see depictions of intense emotion in any of the artistic representations, to my knowledge. There's some studies on sort of depictions of enigmatic or slight smiling but that sort of agony that we have in the lions. And also, I think the really interesting point is that we see the energy in the king sources as well. The idea, the presentation of the king is one of just sort of effortless serenity. And I suspect that any emotion present in his depiction would be something that would detract from that kind of standard Assyrian view of how the body is presented.
So I think that in the Q&A, the comment is speaking to that. She says it seems to be propaganda for the king, right? So I guess
absolutely. All of this is incredibly propaganda for the king. I mean, the royal inscriptions are propaganda for the king. This is sort of the grand fallacy, not fallacy, but one of the major issues when we consider Assyriology is that one of our largest historical sources are essentially the king's PR machine. So of course, this is a depiction of the power and might of the king. When we read through these sources and read into other material, so the letters as well, I think that's where we see more of the personal aspects. The reliefs were from the palace. So these are reliefs that, you know, the Assyrian palaces have been, in the case of Ashurnasirpal II, I would almost say dismembered because it's in so many different museums. A lot of the reliefs are disintegrating at the bottom of the Tigris because they kept capsizing the boats when they were taking them out. We've lost a lot. But when you go to, for example, the British Museum, you can get a sense of the narrative of the reliefs. And this would have been what greeted individuals and would have been in different parts of the palace. So this was a display of might and power that had a very deliberate use. They also would have been painted. The British Museum had a wonderful exhibit a few years ago on Ashurbanipal, and they did a digital reconstruction of some of the color. So it would have, I mean, the kind of collective power being surrounded by these reliefs would have been quite staggering, one imagines.
Okay, there's a question from David.
Thanks so much. There is a good parallel in a Greek artistic tradition. In Pergamum, for example, it is foreigners who are shown expressing intense passion. A very famous sculptural complex is called the Dying Gaul. And it's not unusual that or exceptional that it's a Gaul who's represented. One of the most characteristic features of the expressing the wild other is the open mouth. You just don't show typical Greek figures with the mouth open. It's not, as some people have claimed, because their teeth were bad, because when you see the open mouths of screaming hysterical figures, for example, women under the emotional impact of Dionysus, or monsters like the Medusa, or dying or some way suffering foreigners, their teeth are fine. They're not represented as decayed. It's rather a convention that, and in some ways, Bakhtin's work on the parts of the body that admit things coming in and going out, the representations of grotesque figures, like very old drunken women, which are made in small statuettes. There's a very sharp contrast between the emotional expression of the idealized male youthful figure and the opposites.
Yeah, some of the non-elite depictions that we get, of course, we have these terracotta plaques that are depictions of basically sexual encounters. And there as well, there's not a lot of expression going on. We don't have mourning depictions as much in the artistic imagery. And I'm always very struck, and this is, you know, something particularly with the presentation from yesterday, that we have these depictions of intensely emotional mourning, right, in Egypt, but we simply don't have that sort of permissible parallel in the art we have examples of, at least.
We have a question from Professor Jaques.
Yes, only a small remark on the Hubaba head that you showed. Actually, it has been shown that it is always a severed head, a cut head, and
yes,
that serves as a protection at the door of the town. And this head on the left side comes from Tel Rimach, And on the other side of the door, actually, you had the Lama, the protective spirit, the protective deity that symbol actually the welcome. So on one side you have this Huvava, who was a terrifying picture of the town, and on the other side it was a welcoming aspect at the door. On the remark, both statues have been lost. Actually, I've been looking for them, but they are lost. That's it.
Yeah, which is so unfortunate, of course. Thank you so much. I'd forgotten entirely about the other side. One of the things I find really interesting is the kind of mapping of course, that we have Humbaba's severed head in the text, but also when we look at Pazuzu as an apotropaic amulet, we can use all of him, but then we can just distill his power down to his terrifying gaze. So we get all of these little Pazuzu head pendants as well. So it seems a marriage of literary basis and also utility.
Are there any other questions for the speaker?
I had a question going back to the liver. Is there only one emotion related to that? Did you not mention the joy of the liver?
The emotions I referenced for joy was primarily connected to body parts. I'm trying to think offhand if we would see the liver as joyous. I don't think this might be a question that Professor Jaques is also.
Yeah, that was where it started. That's where it started in my mind, because Professor Jaques did talk about the liver.
Yes, yes, you have an emotion with a liver, or ook actually, but it is not a positive emotion.
It's like we see
it's a negative emotion. Yeah.
Oh yes, it's a negative emotion.
Like
because we have the
you have Orsa also, which is a good liver, which is also a positive one.
Yeah, so that's I'm a little bit interested in that, because we also have expressions about the liver for anger, where the liver feels like it's being crushed. And I do think that the language of the body is very important to trying to sort out how we understand the content of an emotion when it's in a text. But what I'm interested in is if we look collectively at whether the organs line up or not, we may find differences. And then back to my thing about culture, we may be taught to feel in a certain way. Some of this may happen just at the level of biology, but some of it we may learn to be nervous in certain ways, or learn to hate nerves, and it actually then expresses through the organ. Because if you go over to China, we have with the 5 elements, each one of the elements is associated with different organs in the body. And even though the Japanese picked that up, they changed the organs around because they didn't like the way the correlations were. So I think that in this area, we might have some common ground on body, the corporal areas and the feelings of those areas and what we're seeing in the text. Yeah, that was just my thought about the liver.
One of the examples for when we have this verb hababu, one of the examples I always think of in Japanese is, like doki doki suru, even though that can be sort of affection as well as nervousness, but this idea of sort of that fluttering feeling as a potential parallel.
Yeah.
Emily, did you have a question?
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for this great talk. I'm interested in your slide when you mentioned awe, radiance, and sheen. So this quality of the idea of sheen, I just didn't know if you could say anything else about that. I was looking at certain words in Egyptian for pity, mercy, that also can be used for, that have smoothness, we're kind of related to smoothness. And so, but thinking about kind of a tactile quality of emotions, or in sheen, the light quality that you're bringing up, or illumination. I was just wondering if you could just say anything about the sheen that you brought up.
Yeah, I mean, this is also something that I know so Jaques talked about in her talk as well. When we look at kind of these qualities of awe, they generally, Paluchtu is something that famously this was described as the sort of calculated frightfulness of the king, and this manipulated power of the king, but it's defined as this kind of divine, this shining radiance. So we stack that sometimes with these other terms. like this radiant awe as well, primarily to my knowledge in reference to the divine when we see so many of them loaded. But you can use this in a number of, kings can have these qualities, divine weapons, demons can have them as well. So it can be an awe that inflicts fear as well. The line between the divine and demonic is thin and poorly guarded, shall we say, in Mesopotamia, particularly for powerful demons. But I mean, in terms of other types of radiance, certainly this idea of joy coming from a shining face, or the idea of withholding compassion being veiling one's face, might be something closer to what you're asking about, I think.
Thank you so much. Fascinating. Thank you.
Any other questions from the panelists or from the audience? It's nice that we ended up kind of chatty, right? We're like sitting in a room together. So it was a nice way to sort of conclude. So I guess we're reaching the end of our allotted time. So let me just thank our speaker, Professor Konstantopoulos, for her wonderful paper, and to all of our speakers over the past couple of days for very enriching and thought-provoking contributions. It would be so nice to be sitting in a room together and continue over drinks or something, but that will be for a future occasion. I have to say it's been such a fascinating experience to learn about all these ancient traditions that I had really not had any inkling about. And so it's been quite humbling as well. And it reminds me that even cross-cultural studies and comparative studies, of which there's so much nowadays, it's really such a thin slice of what there is. And so hopefully we can move beyond the usual suspects of Greece and China and Rome and India. So David, you've done an amazing thing in organizing, sort of masterminding this gathering. So I have the honor of making some concluding remarks. So I would like to just return to the aims of our conference series and to share my thoughts about what I think is the value of looking at these traditions together in the way that we've done here. So the basic idea of the Before Emotion project, as David explained yesterday, is to explore and interrogate how what we today call emotion might have been approached, presented, mapped, conceptualized in a variety of classical languages. So why should we do this, right? What can we accomplish by studying Hittite, Egyptian, Mayan, Japanese, Sumerian, and Akkadian altogether? I think there are many, many good reasons and many levels of reasons. So I just like to mention 4 of them. First, I think it's perhaps the most obvious one, that excavating and examining the variety of past discourses and approaches to emotions provides us with a richer picture of human history, especially now when traditional geographically defined boundaries of academic fields are being questioned very directly. An appreciation of how emotions were conveyed in vastly different traditions, separated in time and space, can contribute to our efforts to preserve the cultural inheritances of the past by recovering its richness and diversity. The second reason is that examining how emotions were presented and possibly conceptualized in a variety of texts and objects and across genres offers a mirror to the present. We can gain insight into worlds of emotions that look very different from our modern psychological approaches to emotions, and thereby explore alternative possibilities. Yesterday, Professor Carter raised the really important point during Q&A that we're seeing really interesting resonances between Mayan and some contemporary approaches to emotions in terms of the integrative understanding of emotional and bodily experiences, which depart from certain long-standing modern approaches. And this is one of the directions that we've actually been heading with colleagues working in the ancient Greek tradition as well. That the Greece-China collaboration has been sort of arriving at this point. So I think there's a lot of room to develop beyond Greece and China. and to work together to explore this avenue. And this is just one example of how the study of past worlds can allow us to make an intervention in the study of emotions today by helping us to rethink some of our assumptions about what emotions are and how they work. And at the very least, it shows us that some of the dominant modern psychological approaches do not speak for what emotions are, but are just as historically particular as any of the past approaches that we are excavating. And only by making this clear can we really have genuine inquiry into our relationship to emotions and to the category of emotion. And so doing this will allow us hopefully to expand the horizons of our experience of emotion. The third reason involves kind of meta-level insights that are afforded by the cross-cultural study of emotions. And this has to do with the basic question of what we're actually doing when we come together, when we bring past traditions into engagement with one another. In the old days, which are not actually that old, the setup was usually that there were these specialists who identified themselves as comparativists and who compared stuff, right? And most often they compared East and West, or some given primitive so-called society with the modern West. And a usual narrative was, well, in the West, there's reason and science, whereas in the pre-modern tradition X, there was emotion, mythology, ritual, religion, mysticism, wisdom, traditions, and so on. And I think pretty much the study of every non-European tradition has had to deal with this kind of colonial framing. And so what's really exciting is that we've now gotten to the point where we could all engage cross-culturally without being comparativist, right? Without carving out this third field that will always be at the margins of some discipline. And we can now entertain the idea that we should engage with other traditions, not just to be more inclusive, but because it makes us better scholars. What a cross-cultural examination of classical traditions allows us to do is to better understand how discourses of emotions arise, in what sorts of texts or material objects, produced by what kinds of people, in what kinds of contexts, for what kinds of purposes. So I was quite grateful to Emily yesterday also for highlighting the colonial background of the study of ancient Egyptian, because this is our shared background, right? Studying pre-modern cultures. And this has been really a limiting factor in the study of emotions in pre-modern traditions. And the colonial narrative has definitely been at work in the study of emotions in China. And I'm pretty sure all of us have had to wrestle with this framing. So for scholars of different pre-modern traditions, coming together and sharing our findings with one another can significantly enhance our understanding of how discourses of emotions are situated in particular explanatory and historical contexts, but also show that there are important commonalities and divergences among traditions. And by noticing these points of commonality and divergence, we can learn not only about other traditions, but also about the features of the traditions that we ourselves have been studying, but may not have noticed before. And finally, working cross-culturally makes it possible to be part of a growing cross-disciplinary community of scholars working across ancient and classical traditions. And I suspect that many of us who study emotions and related topics have found ourselves somewhat at the margins of the various disciplines or fields that we are part of or supposed to be part of. This has definitely been the case for me. And the most wonderful thing that has happened to me in terms of my scholarship has been to realize through my work that if I'm a kind of misfit among sinologists, then I'm right at home with scholars working on topics, my topics, but in different traditions. And being part of this community has helped me to grow so much in my scholarship, and has also allowed me to undertake exciting collaborations like this one, through which I can help shape the trajectory of my own field. And so this sort of support network, if you will, has really provided resources for developing the study of emotions in Chinese and East Asian traditions in a way that's more hospitable to my kind of research. And it's on this point about the value of this kind of enterprise for creating a community of like-minded scholars that I'd like to conclude this conference. And so while this is the end of this conference, I hope that it's the beginning of an ongoing conversation for years to come, not only among the panelists, but for all the scholars who are out there today joining us from all over the world. And now that we've sort of mapped out this common space of inquiry, and I've had this wonderful opportunity to engage with one another, we can proceed in a sort of a spirit of intellectual fellowship and continue to learn from each other and hopefully have occasion for further conversations. So we are planning an edited volume of papers from today's panelists, as well as those written by last year's panelists, which covered 6 other traditions. So Pia Campigiani covered Greek, Françoise Mirguet covered Hebrew, Ruth Capston covered Latin, Maria Haim covered Sanskrit, Nancy Kulik, Arabic, and I covered classical Chinese. And we will hopefully include some other papers that include a few other languages, including Persian and Korean. So we are looking ahead to that exciting project. And finally, let me thank once again, David and the NYU Center for Ancient Studies for hosting this event, Matthew Santarocco, its director, for supporting this project from the very beginning, Anna Danche for her work behind the scenes to bring this all to realization, to all our panelists and all of you in the audience who took the time to join us today. So I don't know if David has any more comments or anything to add, but
you have summarized it perfectly, Curie. No worry to add, only to thank everyone and all participants and repeat your expression of gratitude and enthusiasm for the project that we've had.
Okay, then on both, I guess for both of us, I wish you all a wonderful rest of the day or evening, wherever you are. And I hope to see many of you again online or in person to continue the discussions we've had here. So thank you so much and goodbye until next time.